Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's podcast. I am absolutely delighted to have a fascinating soldier scholar, as some people refer to him, Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, KBE, CBE, QCVS, no less. Simon has a fascinating history and life, captured along with his family in Soldier in the Sand, which is a great book. I'm thoroughly enjoying reading it. And if you love your history of that region, the Middle East and all that goes on, a number of the British wars that have gone on, have a read of that book. I thoroughly recommend it, Soldier in the Sand. Simon's been to university 3 times, Balliol College, Oxford, when he read history. He was also at St. Antony and King's College. He was a young officer in the 15th, 19th King's Royal Hussars, served in the Sultan of Oman's forces. On the back of the book, you can see a handsome picture of him looking tanned with the Tom Cruise shades. He was ops officer in the First Gulf War, in the liberation of Kuwait. He was commanding officer of the Queen's Dragoon Guards, commanded the 1st Mechanized Brigade when it went into Kosovo for the liberation of Kosovo, and did a number of very senior tri-service roles, DCDS operations, for those who are not in the military, a very senior role, but deputy commander in Baghdad. And towards the end of his career in the military, he was the defense senior advisor for the Middle East and the Prime Minister's security envoy in Iraq. What a fascinating role. He was deputy to General the Lord Dannatt, Richard Dannatt, who we had on the program on episode 200, referred to as the lieutenant in the Tower of London, which sounds very sort of junior, but anything other than that, and a lovely and very important historic ceremonial role. And he also was ADC to Baggy, General Sir Nigel Bagnall, who was led the Ginger Group of some of the brightest brains in the army. And I remember when I worked for Field Marshal the Lord Inge, we had Ginge and Inge, the two who were very respected leaders in the British military, and what a great role model he had. Without further ado, Simon, it's great having you on the show. Thank you for being with us today. Let's go straight into inspiring leadership, the theme of the podcast. What does it mean to you, and who for you has been inspiring, and what kind of qualities have you seen?
Well, I'm very fortunate, dare I say, my choice of parents. Always a good way to kick your life off. My father was in the military, so I had very good exemplars when I was a youngster. I think leaderships, I know many of your people who've got the privilege of being on your podcast, is very much that consciousness of either inspiring you to do something you probably would like to have done anyway, but were too idle. That's happened quite a lot. And certainly, the old-fashioned one, which is inspiring to do something you absolutely had no intention of doing or wanting to do. And I think those that I've picked up early on there was very much those that amuse you, interest you. I think again you'll have had a debate about character and integrity, and the leaders who can really. It's follow me out of the trench, boys, and you just say, right, the hell with it. And those who are just so professionally competent that you just trust their judgment and you just admire them for the commitment they've put into becoming masters of their trade. And of course, the great ones are often those who can command both sides of it. And one thinks of Bill Slim, historical. But I was very fortunate to be with Nigel Bagnall, for instance. My first commanding officer was another one, very, very, a man of great humanity, very professional. As a young officer, you felt mentored, you felt nurtured. With someone like Bagnall, you spotted he didn't have the great flamboyant elan, but you just knew by watching other people's attitude to him. He just dominated intellectually the room. He just was the master of his brief. And then there were people I remember with somebody, again, might be well known to many of your listeners, Harry Deal Payne. And Harry Deal Payne definitely fell into the great character, but may have had other sides to his character. But I do remember him turning up at the 15th night of the King's Royal Hussars, and I was just a young subaltern, and the cry went up, gentlemen, the divisional commander, and we all sort of crashed to attention in the gymnasium. And this chap came in and he put his swagger stick on the thing, took off his cap, and he said, right, gentlemen, I am Harry Deal Payne, your divisional commander. I cannot tell you how proud I am to have the 15th, 19th, the King's Royal Hussars in my bloody hell, every man, get those chest expanders out. We were walking on air. And actually, he was a brilliant soldier, but he did have one or two character flaws that eventually, sadly, brought him down before he'd reached his thing. So an exemplar, but different types of command inspire you at different times, I think.
Yeah, and you and I were talking before, and we talked about, as Richard did on the other podcast, that sometimes people have great character, but if they haven't got a compass, a true north that they keep to, they'll get off everywhere. We've obviously seen lots of that in the press with Boris and all that goes on, and different other strong men like Trump and things, with their integrity is really the thing that brings them down. What's your learning about just how important that is?
I think it's very important. I mean, it's easy to say it. There's professional integrity, and it goes back to professionalism, really. And again, listeners can translate it into their own arenas, but undoubtedly officers, leaders, doesn't need to be officers, anyone who carries rank, frankly. And not necessarily even that. I mean, it's very interesting how, we sort out leaders from those we identify who are going to have those qualities. But that professional integrity, really important. The personal integrity does become increasingly important.
Yeah.
And that inability, particularly in the military, I think it's not remotely, maybe politics as well. You can't divorce your professional from your personal lives.
No.
And undoubtedly, I feel if you morally lack integrity, it inevitably must seep over into your professional integrity. And the military is all about, of course, service to others, service to the nation on the way up, God, Queen, country, clearly service to the soldiers you're going to take into operations, or just manage their careers or inspire them later. And I just feel there's a hollowness if a person doesn't have moral integrity, even where he's a very good commander in many other boxes being ticked.
Yeah, and where we question their judgment, which is a real killer one. What's interesting now is you've got a number of extra things. You're never bored. You're the chairman of the National Army Museum. You're also an advisor to Coutts and Greenhill Company, who are a global investment bank, and also on the board of an oil company. And when you're working with these different organizations, the National Army Museum looking after the history of the army and all that goes on and its future, but the others where they're business organizations with a commercial bottom line, how good are they at really taking in advice, like the kind of things you're talking, and your experience from them? Are they hungry to learn and pick up the best from the military to go with the best of business?
I think when they're exposed to it, Jonathan, there's no guarantee in this day and age that any of them will have had any contact necessarily with the military. A lot of them bring a stereotype about the military. A lot of them bring a stereotype about leadership in the military, which you and I know well, and anybody who knows the military well is very much about encouragement, mentoring. The yelling at people is such a rare thing. All people with a shared sense of purpose in an organization that they trust that's going forward needs very little of that, as I say, the stereotypical shouting. Yeah. Issues of motivating people through money, it's just a different set of carrots and sticks. An awful high turnover I see in banks. I do enjoy Coutts. I'm not here to give a plug for Coutts. Coutts, because I'm a historian by academic preference and training and inclination. I like, because it does wear its 330-year history. I was going to say lightly, I actually mean the alternative. They really do a lot about trying to sell that corporate integrity and the length of, and why the bank has survived so long in a manner that would be very recognizable to us in the military. I'm a great believer in institutions and that idea of you commemorate, you celebrate, and you inspire. And I think that's what great institutions do. They take from the past. They absolutely make everybody in it now feel good about themselves. And they look to reinvigorate themselves by bringing the next generation on. I think, again, good organizations have that. They're not beholden to the past, but they know what bits inspire them, and it contributes to their own moral compass.
I think it's a nice way of putting it. And that brings me nicely once again to to your book, Soldier in the Sand, where it was fascinating that you combined the history of the family and how they'd got themselves, different members of your family, out to the Middle East, how they all met. But then you've got the different stages of the different wars and the different conflicts that you've been involved in and the studies that you've done. Looking at your life journey, I'm very interested in this metaphor of that our lives are a bit like a map that we get given by our parents. I'm going on an organization called the Hoffman Institute. It's a 7-day immersion. And you look back at your childhood and what went on. And that the parents give us these maps and they go, here you are, this is your sort of life map. But you start as you're going along, you add things to it, a bit like in 1100 when you were looking at the map of Africa. It was white, most of it. It was, no one had drawn any rivers or maps or roads. And you've got to fill it in. Here you go, Simon, this is your map from us as parents. We'll give you our values, but you don't have to follow them, but it served us well. With the life journey that you've had, the experiences that have shaped you and those different conflicts that you've been involved in, what would you highlight in just perhaps 10 minutes or so from your life that people would listen to and go, that's really interesting. I could sort of add some of that richness to my own life map. What would you pick out from learning from it?
I love being in. I do like institutions. I was lucky. I was an eldest son. My father was a pilot in the Air Force. Was a great exemplar for me, and so in some ways, I never went through the sort of teenage angst years. I very much wanted to follow my father into a profession that I saw he loved, had huge professional satisfaction out of, and I saw his peer group and the admiration they had for him, which again is reinforcing and reaffirming. I went to university. I studied history. History again gave me a real desire to be in an organization that held history and the exemplars of history at its heart. Defenders, taking inspiration from, taking warnings from, and as you know in the book, my book's quite critical about our failure to understand history, and therefore not failure to understand other people's history. I was going to go into the Royal Air Force. I couldn't pat my head and rub my stomach. My father had a funny journey into the Air Force by going to Sandhurst, so he rather said go to Sandhurst. And early on, I was surrounded by, because I suppose it was that journey that I was temperamentally suited to something like the army. I then found I was surrounded by people I admired, both people I looked up to, people I admired who are having their own life journey, very soldiers, as we all know, from very broken backgrounds, chaotic things. That sense of purpose early on, service, and a peer group who I admired for their resilience, their flexibility, their great good humor, much of it, moral and physical courage, excitement, and those sort of things were just very fortunate to have. I didn't go through a great soul searching. I thought about leaving the army a couple of times, and I'm very, very grateful that circumstances conspired against me, because I found it got more and more interesting, even the dullest day in the Ministry of Defence. And I did several in my time. One still felt that sense of purpose. One still felt that the context you were operating within was of importance, as it was, of course, on operations or commanding. I still felt I was surrounded by people, again, who were putting the job. Of course, they were ambitious, quite rightly too. I was ambitious. I felt that people were, yes, given a left and right about when it comes to moral compass. They knew types of behavior would just either expose themselves or the organization to reputational damage, and I think that's helpful in life. And then one did have at certain times the likes of Nigel Bagnall, the likes of General John Waters, commanding officers who I admired, who'd sit you down, take the time to communicate, talk to you about their own journey, talk to you, as a one-for-one as professional soldiers together. And I just was eternally grateful that I did my full 40 years in the military. I never, ever regretted it. And I think I'd be lucky in that. There are things you give up. I didn't ever get married, so most of my colleagues, of course, did. So they combined their professional satisfaction with families as well, even though I know that the military life does put a lot of pressure on families, and a weak relationship it'll find out, but a strong relationship, because it's obviously a good thing to do, really binds people in. So it's great. So I've had an easy journey in many ways. I haven't had to thrash around, but it's one that suited my temperament and my background, and I've been eternally grateful for it.
Well, it's been a fascinating life thus far. There's still, at 66, there's still a lot more life to go, with much more to go if we can make it to the 100-year life. I'm always interested with all that wealth of experience you've had, from Kuwait to Morocco and all around the Middle East. If you were to pick sort of 3 or 4 trends of things you think are going to happen, you and I were talking about, the inevitable wish of China to regain Taiwan, bring it back under its wing, under its fold, and that might lead to a war. What might happen in the Middle East with Iran versus Saudi Arabia, in the power struggle there? What do you think are a couple of big events that are going on? Obviously, one of them is what Russia will do as we think about the Ukraine war. What would you think? Just in a nutshell, a few things you're expecting to happen in the next 10 years.
I describe it as the 3 sort of images of the Middle East. One is the one that Edward Said in Orientalism really hated, which is Westerners responding to the romanticism and exoticism of the Middle East. The second one, of course, is the one that a lot of people who don't know the Middle East necessarily also react to, which is endless scenes of explosions, war, bombing, ISIS fighters. And the third one, of course, is the very human story of the Middle East and the culture and the empowerment of women and the move away from fossil fuels and the ambition and the aspiration and the inspiration they draw from. And it's all there together. It's difficult not to be a bit gloomy because the brakes on reform remain very, very strong because of the nature of culture and the continuing influence on religion. The volatility between Persians, Arabs, and Turks, and you might say Egyptians, remains. The divisions between Sunni and Shia, the obvious ones, are there. The attraction to societies with young men disenfranchised, unemployed, looking for purpose, attracted to some of the more extreme ideologies of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State still remain. And then on top of that, of course, Jonathan, you have to put water stress. You have to put perhaps some of the near-term consequences of potential famine. And we know how famine leads to social disorder, leads to political unrest. And then demographics. We're getting used to stories about declining populations here, Russia the same, China the same, India overtaking. But in the Middle East, the median age is about 24. And that just tells you there's nothing you can do about it, that the population is going to double in the next 50 years. And so the scope with fractured states, with volatility, political violence, as I say, water stress, pressure on the land, too many people in the urban for either migration or social unrest, I think is large. And then, of course, you put in issues of nuclear proliferation and always the possibility of an outbreak of violence that could be something. So while it's a part of the world I love, and I hope that comes through in the book, and I've been again grateful that my career not only took me to high rank and gave me a very, very interesting time, but a lot of it was to do with the Middle East out of either necessity or inclination. It's quite difficult not to be gloomy. And I think this is where you need statesmen, leaders, to be looking at it in the round. And I always used to say, you can't, these are regional issues. And I used to say, and I never put it in my book, and people have heard me say it so often, if you want to understand this problem, you've got to get yourself a bigger map. And there's no doubt about it, anything to do with the region and the continuing importance of energy supplies there, you've got to unfold the map all the way out to China, of course, clearly north into, what is, Russia and the West at the moment, but actually has global implications. And of course, all the way to the east along the North African coast and across the Atlantic to what's happening with America. And as as we discussed earlier, America's place in the world.
Yeah. fascinatingly put, and I will take that one away, particularly as you and I were discussing the metaphor of personalizing your map. And I think that's a lovely adage to it, is get a bigger map, unfold it. You're looking at a very small part of your life. What is it like in comparison to everybody else around you and what's going on? Are you seeing the bigger picture? And I think when I look on some of the CEOs and the leaders I'm lucky enough to coach, they sometimes have too small a map with it really folded very neatly. I remember when we did the escape and evasion exercise when I was in the electronic warfare regiment with the signals. And when people were captured by the force in their escape and evasion, if they'd been so stupid as to fold their map down to a small area, even though they weren't ever marking the map, there was grubby lines around where it'd been folded. And so they needed just to put together 4 of these maps, and they knew exactly where the agent was going to be because of the overlap of the folds. And they just knew somewhere in there was the agent and we're going to capture him. And they did, which was very clever of them.
Well, if I may, Jonathan, just because when I was in Iraq and even back in the Ministry of Defense, and we were dealing with Iraq, the map would go up. And Iraq was colored in and everything around it was in white.
Oh, no.
As if what was going on in Turkey, Iran and Syria and Saudi Arabia had no influence on the campaign we were trying to fight within Iraq itself. And the Euphrates Valley, of course, went straight up through Syria. And that's where all these jihadists were coming down the Euphrates Valley. And you just thought, no, we've got to know what's going on in Damascus and Tehran. We've got to know what Erdogan's thinking in Ankara. We've really got to know what the king of Saudi Arabia is doing. All these people are critical to our mission.
So anyway. True. No, I think that's a really brilliant point. And we were saying how, again, with this analogy of maps, that your parents give you a map of Africa in the 1100s, which is all just the outline of it, and it's white inside it. No one knows what's going on there. But like in those days when we had the AA road map, and you were traveling back from Germany and you were passing through Holland and you went through, I don't know, Antwerp or somewhere, and it was just white. And you went, oh no, where's the bigger map for this? And you had to find it on another page. Otherwise, you were suddenly into this big box of white, which was a city you didn't know what was there. No, I love that. I love that story. But get a bigger map, unfold it. Very true. Very. Thinking about your own life and this fascinating book, if you were to pick just one in each case of a really happiest moment, proudest moment in your life, and a darkest moment, and as Rudyard Kipling said, treat those 2 imposters just the same. What did you learn from your happiest, proudest moment? What did you learn from your darkest personal moment?
Well, I think, among many, I say I was fortunate enough, round peg, round hole. Huge admiration for those who strike out and fill in that blank map you're talking about, Jonathan. I went on to a map that was quite well populated because it was the army and regiments, etc. So it's a personal journey. I did love going to Oman. Although, things like commanding the Queen's Dragoon Guards, commanding my brigade were fantastic, huge privilege. Going to Oman just was such coalescence of so many things that I suppose appealed to my temperament. It was exotic. It was, capital R romantic. I was only 29. I was an acting major. I had more money in my pocket than any other time. I was, wearing a shamag, the Tom Cruise, whatever. I was commanding at a young age. I was commanding Arabs in another language. I was immersed in a culture that I felt deeply comfortable in. And that 3 years defined it. I did more demanding soldiering. I did more worthwhile, whatever, but it was at a time and place in one's life. At the end of my career, I have to say, and it's in the book, and it didn't have those sort of elements so much, but I'm very, very proud of having got the first permanent British military base east of Suez since 1971, with the base in Bahrain.
Bahrain, yeah.
And I was very proud when the Navy very handsomely unveiled Mayall Square.
Yes.
So I'm not sure you find all that. So, I've had the spectrum of professional satisfactions from the military. A dark time, undoubtedly, was when I got a letter saying I wasn't going to command the regiment I joined. Again, I'm not remotely putting that in the same pot as people who've had personal tragedies. I've been spared those. But at a professional and personal level, it was it was a kick, because as you well know, you want to command your regiment, or you certainly want to command a regiment. And I really did feel at that stage I was probably going to leave the army. And equally, I was very conscious that some of the reasons I wasn't going to command was probably a justifiable criticism of the way I'd played a bit fast and loose, I suppose, with my own career up till then. That one had, been, there'd been elements of, selfishness. I'm sure alone in this, but one's got to acknowledge it. And it did hold up a mirror to me. Yes, the professional disappointment, but also a personal wake-up call that one was confronted with people who were prepared to acknowledge that you had a number of talents that the army could well do without, but that regiment had decided, no, we don't think you're the full deal yet.
Who did command it?
I wouldn't. And he commanded it jolly well.
Okay.
But
how did you got your second chance? Because you commanded another regiment, another very good regiment, the Queen's Dragoon Guards. How did that come about, and what stopped you from leaving?
And I went to see John Waters, and I showed him the letter. And I was very fortunate. I'd known John Waters from the time I'd known Bagnall. And luckily, I'm sure he could see all my weaknesses. He was one of those flash, glib cavalrymen, probably pretty good when he's put under pressure a bit, but if he's not really interested. I had that on Bagnall's report on it. He said he could go a long way in the army, but it totally depends if he's prepared to put he could drift off. And so I luckily had allies. And there's no doubt about it, I would say, Jonathan, I was a much better commanding officer of the Queen's Dragoon Guards, a fantastic regiment, as you well know. I'm fiercely loyal to them. I was a better commanding officer than I would have been if I'd got, inverted commas, as of right to command what was then the Light Dragoons. I would have gone in with a sense of entitlement, a sense of my own self-importance, and I was a better commander, I was a better leader for my soldiers and subordinates. I was a better guardian of the great institution of the Queen's Dragoon Guards, and later on for that disappointment. And I say I'm not going to put it in the balance against people who've had real personal tragedies, but it was having had a fairly easy life, drifting up, educationally, family. It was a wake up call.
And that's a really good point. So the lesson for those listening, you won't get what you want. Life doesn't always deal at you in a plate, but actually when one door closes, another one opens, which gave you a completely different career to the one you would have had. So there's fascinating lessons from that, which takes us on to lessons you'd give.
And the other one, sorry, Jonathan, just there is how you handle disappointment.
Yes.
And that absolutely, and I was absolutely, again, one has a fairly optimistic nature. I think I put it in the book, crisis, danger, and opportunity, the Chinese diagram. And again, this is not putting that against personal tragedy, but how you deal with disappointment always impresses other people, or people notice it. And you just got to say, I'm partly the architect of my own disappointment.
Yes.
And I'm going to learn. I've got to make that a learning experience as far as I can.
And that's very good. And for those who listen, and it's a well-known phrase, but it might be new to some, that if I'm right in playing that back to you, that the Chinese symbols for crisis are two symbols, danger plus opportunity. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. And
that's
so
correct.
that when you have a crisis, in it, there is great danger for you, but there's also great opportunity if you're prepared to seek it. And thinking about advice you'd give to others listening, advice to young men now, age 16 to 18, if you went back and met the Simon Mayall in that early stage in your life, before you went to Balliol College and joined the army, what would you say? Don't do this, but do that. A couple of bits of advice would you give to a young man now?
Well, I would certainly actively encourage anybody who's remotest inclination to join the armed forces to do it. I've met a lot of people, and I'm sure you have, Jonathan, who at about the age of 40, very successful in their own fields, say, I wish I'd done time in the army.
Yeah.
Because I really do think whether you do 3, 5, 40 years, the experiences, the life skills, the opportunities, the privileges and responsibilities you will get, the friends that I think almost anybody in the army always talks about, the quality of their friendships. You know, and I always say to people, don't miss it. You'll live longer, you'll have to work hard, you'll have to work longer probably. And any number of people, and you know, you're a shining example, can do time in the army and then go into something else. But what you can't ever do is turn the clock back to that youngish man or woman and do the time in the army. And I don't think I've ever known anybody, except somebody maybe who got the wrong moral compass, who's ever regretted, never left the army because they didn't like it. They left for all sorts of other very good reasons. But I have yet to meet somebody who said, I completely wasted my time going into the army.
No, you're so right. And just stay with that for a moment. Looking back, I think I count the blessings of being so different from my peers in my own profession, working with boards and top teams, in that military experience gave me a differentiator, gave me insights from my mistakes as well as some of the successes I had, but also very fine leaders that I worked with, who I will always remember if they were here. And particularly, you know, Richard was commanding officer to me when I was one of his very young acting major company commanders. But I still think, when I say to some of these CEOs, if Richard Downet was here now, he wouldn't say very much. He'd listen a lot, and then he'd just capture in a summary, in a sentence or two, exactly what needs to be done. And people go, wow, yeah, that's it. And people like that you never forget, or Bagnall, do you? You just don't forget those.
No, and they mark you. Now, these are people who are considerably older than you. Not Richard was commanding officer, actually, no, but Bagnall, it was very interesting. I was, whatever, 23, 24, and he was, you know, at the height of his powers, 50. But you know, as I got older, the more interest you take in your subordinates. It's funny because you see your own time coming to an end, you see that, and you see the next generation. And I think your loyalty to your institution, be it the regiment or the army, wants you to invest in these great young men and women in the hope you can persuade them to stay. I mean, you can't persuade them all to stay, of course you can't. But the idea that you can still capture some people, you can still influence people to see in the institution what you have given to it. Yeah. And join, you know, what we call the long grey line, I think, as they call it at West Point. You know, pick up the baton, carry it on, look after the next generation of your soldiers, take that huge pleasure and privilege. And again, it's not, as we say, unique to the military, but it's so front and foremost in the military, because if you're a junior in any other organization, you're a junior. You've got seniors there and you learn your trade and you're professional. But I think, as Richard said on his thing, you know, with the left Sandhurst, 27 Green Howards on the streets of there. Yeah. You are responsible. I don't care how old you are, you're carrying the rank. Yeah. You have that responsibility, you have command authority, and you have that responsibility.
Well, it's a very small world that the two of you happen to be together, to serve together and then be together at the Tower, because of course, he explained to me that Nigel Bagnall began as a Green Howard. Yes. And he went to see his commanding officer as a young officer and said, "Sir, I want to go to Staff College." To which the rather casual, relaxed Green Howards went, "Staff College? Green Howards don't go to Staff College, old boy." So no, this is not the kind of serious part of the army. They're taking it seriously. So he transferred into his regiment of the cavalry, which I thought was a lovely story. But thinking about you and all those experiences you've had in life, if there was one crucible moment in all the different things you've done that shaped you so much in your career, and there's maybe a lesson for people listening, what would that crucible moment be?
I think it was funny enough, it was the disappointment. The crucible moment for me I just knew I wanted to be a soldier. And so I almost left when I came back from Oman, because I was at that age. It's time to go on. The disappointment, as I say, turning that disappointment of failure round. And again, I don't want to overstate it, because, as I say, I haven't suffered personal tragedies as such. And then that realization that I really, really valued the purpose and everything about the military. That I really didn't want to leave, that I was dying to be given, as it were, a second chance to be back in the game. Yeah. But I think it was really good to find affirmed for oneself that you were in an organization with a sense of purpose you completely subscribed to.
Yeah.
So I think there was a disappointment. There was a good kicking, which I think would be useful in any, if any cocky chap who's getting above himself. I think it was very nice to be confirmed that you genuinely, it's not hardly Saul on the road to Damascus, but it was good to feel one was there with something at purpose and wanted to continue to contribute.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Now you're advising businesses. When I look at some of the good leaders I meet in business, they learn almost by accident rather than a career plan for them, where they go away on courses and they're developed, and someone talks about their career and what they should be doing, discuss with them what options they could do next, and how we're going to develop you. I mean, they must have invested, I don't know, £250,000 developing you over all these courses you've done, and RCDS and lots of senior courses and staff college, and yet sadly they put someone into a CEO role and they go, on you go. No preparation, no training, no development. And if they spend I don't know, £20,000 over someone's career, they think that's generous. What's your lesson for business leaders? What can they do to make more of developing their own leaders?
I do understand it. I mean, the thing in the army, of course, you are looking at it in the context of 40-year contribution to an institution, if you go the whole way. And that is great. I do get why civilian firms won't do it. They'd rather somebody else took up the time and the money of training somebody, and they'll go out obviously through headhunters to find somebody who they think has had that investment who might be good for them. But I think there's no doubt about it. It's difficult if you are doing lateral transfers the whole time to build up the ethos of loyalty. That's where it is interesting that some great firms, I think of Procter & Gamble, for instance, almost everybody, as far as I understand, I know if you will, who's at the top of Procter & Gamble has come up from the bottom, because they obviously have an ethos, a cultural business ethos that tries to get good people in and then incentivizes them precisely, I think, with that investment in obviously monetary reward, but remuneration, but a career path. I think a lot of other companies don't do that, and I think they leave themselves open to reputational risk, because we are, or in the army, in a regiment, you can spot the person who is playing fast and loose with the reputation of that regiment. Back to moral compass.
Yeah, which
really,
takes me
you don't necessarily get that in a civilian organisation, and why should you expect, unless you're a particular type of organisation?
Exactly, which that moral compass takes me on nicely to, let's go around the inspiring leadership compass with the 8 components, and just quick fire questions and your sort of top tips for people. MQ is the first one, the true north, the top. You've talked a lot about your values and your upbringing. When you've come off true north, for whatever reason, what have you done to bring yourself back on? How can, when people have drifted from what they know to be the right thing, how do you get yourself back on again? And how do you make up for the fact that you've slipped? It may not be you personally, but others have. What would be your advice?
I always remember the rather interesting one. Somebody claimed it was from Romania, and the great cry was, "Where there's shame, there's still hope."
Oh, right.
And I thought it's good. It's like, whether having a sense of shame is good, but I do think if you do have a moral compass, and we all hope we do have it, we're normally pretty aware when we've stepped off it. And I do think the esteem of people you esteem is a really important corrective. And I think we said it earlier, or before we started formally chatting. It is, one does like to go through life being affirmed by the good opinion of people you admire.
Yeah.
And I think the army, and just there is a God, Queen, and country. There is the regiment, dear boy, the regiment type thing. There is disappointing your mentors, disappointing your peer group, and I have seen officers behave dishonestly. And I did remember talking to my subalterns at one stage over the dreaded thing. motor mileage allowance, Jonathan, which you may remember,
Mm-hmm.
which in a sense is open to abuse. All expenses are open to abuse. And I just said, A, it's absolutely wrong anyway, but temptation does come along. But I said, you as officers in the Queen's Dragoon Guards, when the Lance Corporal in the RMP is asking you to justify the fact that you didn't really go to Inverness, or dare I say, and we've seen a high profile case of boarding school allowance, another one which lead me not into temptation. And you're explaining to your parents why you have forfeited your commission in the Queen's Dragoon Guards, Her Majesty's Armed Forces, for the sake of a pitiful amount of money. Yeah. And I said, you just, anything you can use, and I write about it in the book, that keeps that moral compass, given we're all human, and there are temptations either to be idle or to be whatever, or to just slack, not take our responsibilities, I think is what is such a great aspect of military service.
Yeah, and this reminds me of an incident when I was serving with the Scots Guards and doing the mountain marathon. There was a moment when myself and the Scots Guards sergeant and a piper, we were near the summit on day one, and we were likely to win, but we were so tired, and they wanted me to stop and sit down. And it was so easy to collude and go with them, and I was tired too. And my courage was at a low ebb. I was exhausted. We'd been running for 4 hours. And I thought, yes, I'll sit down. And then I thought, no, this is the moment. No one will see you, but you know that you're on a mountainside alone with these two soldiers, but they know if you've chickened out or whether you had the courage to keep going and win. Yeah. And so I had a conversation with my late father, up on a cloud sitting there saying, Jonathan, commit or collude, your choice, you'll know. And you said there, don't slack. That's the moment when you shouldn't, but no one else will know, but you know. And you've got to look yourself the man in the mirror, haven't you? And you've got to face yourself.
And if you have command responsibility, Jonathan, and other people are looking to you to set that example, that again is really useful. And the cry we've often had, you've probably heard it before, we hope and expect and assume even that our people will do the right thing on a bad day, even when no one's watching. Mm. Yeah, and I've always found that, and you've tried to say to your soldiers, you wear the cat badge, you're members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. I really want to think that you will do that right thing on that bad day when nobody's watching. Yeah. And you begin to identify those that can. And it's particularly if as you say, you've got the privilege and responsibility of rank, because you've just got, that's why you're an officer. Yeah. And it helps hugely, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, and you sort of know when you're wilting or you're lacking the courage to tackle something which is not acceptable, but it's so easy to go with the crowd and collude, but doing the right thing is always the hardest thing. It needs to force through, which takes us on to purpose, the next one, Simon. That sense of meaning and purpose, your calling, your vocation. I've heard it from you very clearly and in your book, service, duty, the regiment, but in the work you're doing now, I suppose the National Army Museum is a continuation of the Army story, but in the other advisory work, what gives you a sense of purpose in what you're doing now at this stage of your life, age 66?
Yeah, I suppose interest. Mm-hmm. It's nice to work at a high level. It's nice to work because one did 40 years in public service. It's interesting to work with consummate professionals in a different sphere. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to observe it. I like what I do as a portfolio because I quite like the freedom, to travel, which I continue to do. I continue to lecture on largely the Middle East, but a number of the things covered in the book. So I like that flexibility within it. Mm-hmm. Quite like getting paid. Let's not, I can't cast out there. Mm-hmm. And it keeps me, it keeps me just interested, and it allows you to meet people. And I normally work with people who are broadly have a focus in the Middle East. Yeah. So it's another way that continues to get me traveling out to a part of the world I feel very comfortable in and really enjoy.
Yeah, and talk about traveling. I understand that you were with David Rutherford Jones or somebody else, maybe it was not him, walking 75 miles in the Pyrenees. This takes me on to health, your health and well-being, your mental health, your physical health. What do you do to keep it going? Because we want to have our health span match our lifespan, particularly you and I are in our 60s. So what tip would you give to those at any stage of their life, but certainly as we get older, to keep your mental and physical health? What would be your top tip?
I think it's very difficult to enjoy anything else in life if you're not healthy. Really, really difficult. Now, as one gets older, one's grateful for having been in a profession that almost made it a duty to keep yourself healthy. I think it really is important that, you know, I know people talk about it a lot, that sort of, you know, mindfulness and the like. I do think being physically healthy keeps you very mentally healthy as well. There's no doubt about it. I'm absolutely good. It clears the mind. If it's a big walking trip, as I did with David Rutherford-Jones in the Pyrenees, it gives you plenty of time to think, clear your mind. It's amazing, you know, what pops in and out, what stupid you know, anecdotes, you know, you remember. I love reading. I'm always been grateful that I'm not intimidated by picking up a large book. I feel very, very angry about the failures of our educational system that deprive so many young men and women from, dare I say, you know, this is a challenge, the bookshelf, as opposed to a window onto the world. I do think keeping interested. I do like travel because I do think you keep meeting interesting people. We're very fortunate the level that we operate at, that we're always exposed to interesting people. But as I get older, I do continue to think, my goodness, I would not be enjoying this as much if I was unwell or suffering some chronic disease.
Yeah, it's very true.
I do also, if I may, John, I went to another great mate called Richard Banfield. We were running around the park. He'd actually just got divorced, and I was in pursuit of somebody else. And I said, you know why we're doing this, Richard? He said, yes, absolutely right. We've got to keep fit. It's very good. I said, no, vanity.
It is, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Fat generals.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than a fat general. It reminds me of that book, The Psychology of Incompetence, wasn't it, or something about military incompetence?
Yeah, Dixon.
Yeah, Dixon, on the psychology of military incompetence. That was it. On the skills that you've been able to use as an advisor and traveling in all these different countries, one of the great skills is emotional and social intelligence, meeting people, reading them, understanding your own emotions and managing them, understanding others, and reading the reality of what's going on in the world and folding the map out.
Yes,
up the Baghdad Valley, up the river. So what is a top tip you'd give about listening, rapport, you know, reading other people?
Yes, the Middle East is a classic case, Jonathan, and you'll know it. I think it comes out in the book. We go out there talking about cultural awareness, and we invest in it a lot more than we used to. Still bad. I used to stand up in front of, you know, fairly junior officers and say, I'm General Simon Mayall, Middle East advisor. I'm the best Arabic speaker in the army. You can tell them all, go, who's this? Whatever. And then I say, the point I'm making is that's an indictment, not a boast. Yeah. I am posting on 3 months at Beaconsfield when I went on loan service in 1985. And I said, that's the point I'd like to make. It's a disgusting, I said, that I should be the Middle East advisor. And no one's invested more than 3 months in my Arabic. And so I really think, you know, the British Army with its global aspirations, Britain with its global aspirations, this issue of language, culture, history, so important. I think so many of the failures in Iraq, and you could say of Afghanistan, what was a failure of understanding context. I'm not saying at the tactical level, but at the strategic level, certainly. Our misreading of the Arab Spring, our misreading all the way back to Shah of Iran. I was talking to West Point audience the other day, and they were talking about the utility of cultural awareness. And I said, our problem is, we get the don't point your feet, drink the cup with your right hand, you know, all this sort of stuff. But our problem is that's fine at the tactical level. At the strategic level, we demonstrate we actually don't like the culture of these countries. And actually, it's the strategic level you're going to win wars. We can win campaigns, battles, tactical engagements. And that's our problem. We have sucked our own Kool-Aid about the wonderfulness of Western civilization. And we go with an arrogance and insouciance, a contempt in some cases that is deeply unhelpful to our cause. So one brings a bit of that. I'm not, again, macro to micro. One brings a bit of that to advising, the companies that go there. And I'm not, there's kind of industry in this, but quite a lot of the advantage that I think Coutts and Greenhill find in me is one goes in to talk about Britain's place in the world, Britain's presence in the Middle East historically. Many of them have been to Sandhurst, understanding the difference between Sunnis and Shias, asking the intelligent question about why the blockade in etc. And then eventually you say, I think you probably would quite like to talk about your investments with my fellows from Coutts. And I think that's what I think is the value added I bring. I'm not one to talk about investment interest rates or mortgages or the like. But I think in a particular environment as the Middle East is, you wouldn't do it for other parts of the world. Somebody who feels really comfortable engaging, likes the place, hopefully palpably likes the area. And I think, that's always reflected. If you're beaming out that you're enjoying being in their part of the world, you're speaking their language, you know their background, it pays back. And it in the commercial world, it opens doors. But it's fun to do anyway. And it's partly a contribution to the United Kingdom's reputation for being better at this than most other people.
No, I think that's beautifully put, and it covers both emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. This reading other people and getting into their shoes and what's their perspective like, and not having the arrogance that the Western world tends to have, thinking that we need to sort these people out and make them have our democracy. Just like we misunderstand China massively, we think they ought to understand our individualism is paramount. They used to go, how selfish are you? You were to understand the culture and the environment and the community. Quick fire questions just before we talk about teams. Top tip you give about resilience, and then brand, and then legacy. What would you give a tip on? Firstly, resilience.
Well, there's no doubt I admire it in other people. I do think it's a terrific. I think it's a terrific quality. A lot of it's nature and nurture. Mm-hmm. I do think it is extraordinarily important in every walk of life. I think we talk about it a lot. I don't think we have a society that necessarily either understands it properly. I remember having this argument discussion with Nick Horton.
Yes,
we were absolutely saying, good high morale is nothing to do with happiness. It's the spirit that sustains in adversity. And it's back to you running, and you could easily have sat down, but your own character, your own sense of yourself, your be a sense of shame, sense of example, sense of pride takes you on, and resilience to put up with disappointments, turn them to. I think that goes back to health. I think if you're physically resilient, that is hugely important. And again, you and I and many people, and I say it's not unique to the military, but there's no doubt about it. People who are tired, people who are unfit, make poor decision makers, make poor leaders. The inspirational side of leadership drops off very fast if a leader proves to be physically not resilient.
Very true. A brand. How about brand? What have you learned about? I don't know whether you ever had 360 feedback. It wasn't something that was used widely in the military before, but now is being used extensively. I had a very interesting conversation with a former Royal Marine who's gone as a Navy captain to help advise Marine amphibious forces in Australia, and as they're preparing their amphibious forces. And he said they're using coaching and 360 feedback from all directions, which is making a phenomenal difference. Not to judge people, it's not part of their grading, but it's just to help them be better officers. What have you gained on any kind of 360 feedback or feedback from people that helps you be a better leader?
Well, it's basically going back to the Adair's balls, as we the team, task, individual, and there's no doubt about it. The judgment of getting the balance right between obviously looking after the individual, which is a bit, I think, overemphasized in too many areas of modern Western life, over the importance of the team sharing that sense of common purpose and then motivated to deliver on the task. And I think how handling individuals, it definitely used to be a lot easier. Certain assumptions were made, certain people arrive with certain assumptions about how they would be treated, what their stereotypes up to a point. It was easier. I find too often, and I look at public sector, the move to make sure the individual is cosseted actually destroys the coherence of the team and makes the delivery of the task, which is frankly what these individuals will be paid for in the first place, increasingly, frankly, problematical. I never really did 360. I was a skeptic, I suppose. I've never had any problem because I thought the reporting system was quite interesting. You thought perhaps that you had your finger on the pulse enough that people would be honest enough with you, that you'd they're not asking for criticism so much, but asking for feedback. But I can see why people might want to formalize it.
Yeah.
And I do know issues of toxic leadership, of which I saw very few, but by goodness, they stood out in the army. I think we'd all have one or two names we could throw there.
Well, it was very interesting looking back through my old reports, which I got long after I left the army when I asked for the release of them. And it reminded me some of the comments from officers I never remember meeting at all who wrote comments about me. And there's that famous one, which was true from the old reporting line, where report written on a female officer, I know him well. And you sort of think, I don't think they really do. But sometimes some people really get people well, but other times what I found very good about the 360, which other people are now using, and I use with a lot of the leaders, they don't like what they hear sometimes from 20 other people in all different directions, below, above, beside them, but they do learn a lot from it. So onto legacy, and then we'll talk about teams, and then your favorite book and a top tip. What would be your legacy? When you sadly come to pushing up those daisies, what would you like people to say about you, Simon? What would be, in a sentence, the legacy you'd like to be remembered for?
Yeah, good bloke, old-fashioned good bloke stuff. I'd like to think that enough people will say, every encounter with Simon Mayall was quite amusing or interesting.
Yeah, I love it.
There's a certain, it's a very difficult one. Yes, within the seriousness of the job he did, I think back to command climate, I like to think that in my own journey, I contributed to the enjoyment that other people had in their journey.
That sounds good to me.
I think that's what I'd like.
I like that.
The people would still want to come up and talk to me, even though I've shed all the generals and sirs, and we're bumping along on the clouds together. They'll still find the time to make their way over and say hi, Simon. Nice to see you. That's
a lovely one. And in your time in the military, it's 40 years, and then what you've seen in business, you've been with some high-performing teams, and you've been with teams that occasionally have individuals who go a little toxic. What have you done to address that issue? Because sometimes people avoid it and the person hangs around for a long time and it affects morale everywhere. How would you advise people listening to this in business deal with someone who's toxic?
I think we'll get two things I would say. Start with back to your own professionalism. It's very difficult to tackle toxic characters if you are not yourself competent. The second one is purpose, where you can actually, remind everybody, the team, you don't need to pick people out, but this is what we're here for. And it's back to we invest in the individual so we form coherent teams so we can deliver this task. And this is what we are all about. And I'm going to invest, and anybody who signs up for that is going to get my support. And anybody who doesn't is going to take it. So, and it sort of depends where you are in the team, of course. It's one thing if you're coming in to lead that team, or whether you're a subordinate leader working for somebody you don't admire, esteem, trust, find credible, or whether you're the person who's drafted in. And quite often, and I'm sure Richard would say that, I'm sure we've all done it to an extent ourselves, we draft people in who we think are good at tearing down teams in order to build them up again.
Yeah.
But it is difficult. It is difficult. And big characters, and I've seen them, we've seen them in messes. They're quite dominant, but they destroy the command climate. They're bullies of one type or another. psychological bullies, physical bullies, sometimes highly talented.
Yeah.
Sometimes very bright, and that's why they're so funny. I don't mean funny, they're clever, they're articulate, but they're fundamentally very destructive.
I've seen that.
And you need good commanders with enough self-confidence to call them out because they are destroying the capacity to deliver on the task.
Yeah, and I have seen that in case of what I call a psychology unsafe. It's a culture of bullying and intimidation.
And I will say that the film that I can hardly bear to watch is Tunes of Glory.
Mm-hmm.
I commend it. If you remember, John Mills taking over a battalion where the second in command is basically Alec Guinness is a completely malign influence on the battalion, really. Yeah. And watching the struggle for the heart and soul of that organization. It's almost. I really commend it. It's toe-curlingly awful.
Yes. Anyway. Well, look, that takes us nicely onto the penultimate point, which is the book. Before we go into the top tip, you and I talked about Bill Slim's Defeat to Victory, which you recommended. What would be another one that you thought was a very good read on leadership for people?
Well, one I really enjoyed, which was very, very accessible, and it was leadership at a very low level, is George MacDonald Fraser's book, Quartered Safe Out Here. Funnily enough, same campaign. And of course, he, in that, both talks about very junior leadership. He was made a Lance Jack. He didn't want to carry responsibility. He'd obviously been identified as intelligent. He talks about the senior old sweats. He talks about Bill Slim. He then talks about, because I think he wrote it at the time of the Gulf War, about commanders being asked to expose their fears. Were they scared? Were they worried about casualties? And he said, my God, that's the last thing, those of us put slogging along wanted to hear, was our commanders were harboring doubts or lack of confidence or the like. And so he talked about, I think, what John Keegan wrote, The Mask of Command, and the importance for all of them that Bill Slim, who amazingly must be like 47 levels above, had imbued through the command climate, through the confidence he gave the 14th Army, something that George MacDonald Fraser was a young man in I think it was King's Own Border Regiment, could possibly feel. And it's a remarkable tribute. And of course, he went on to be an officer himself and then wrote some more scurrilous books on flash.
Yeah, I loved the flash.
No moral compass. No moral compass at all.
No moral compass. Absolutely not. No, it was a favorite book I read as a young officer and very influential for me. So, Simon, would you finally, just for a piece in its own right, would you just introduce yourself, the work you're doing and the role you've had in the past, and give us your 2-minute top tip on leadership?
Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, former cavalryman, commander of the Queen's Dragoon Guards, commander of the 1st Mechanized Brigade, many MOD jobs, and a focus, both family, academic and professional, on the Middle East. And if I was going to give 2-minute top tips, these things always come in threes, but I think if one distills down things, I would say my first one would be understanding and imbuing everyone around you with a sense of purpose. I think good leaders who can articulate what their core business is and remain very focused on that, so that every decision they make, every judgment they make, you can almost second guess by how it links back to purpose. The second one, I would argue, in any leader would be professionalism. I believe a really competent professional leader who knows his business inside out can dispense with many of the other tricks of the trade of leadership and command by just setting an example of sheer competence. Clearly, much better it is combined with a character that inspires, amuses. And the third one, I think, in the broader sense, is to communicate. Communication. You need to communicate that sense of purpose. You need to communicate your own credibility and your own competence. You need to communicate both up, down, and around. And the sheer capacity to bring people in to your project through that communication, into that purpose and demonstration of professionalism. So purpose, professionalism, communication.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed, Simon, for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. It was fabulous. We could have chatted for hours. I know people will take a wealth of experience from you. And as I mentioned before, Soldier in the Sand, a thoroughly great read, which I very much enjoyed, with full of nuggets of history and advice. Thank you very much for your wisdom.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.